The current crisis in Ukraine started over a year and a half ago with peaceful protests in the capital and quickly escalated into a near civil war in the eastern half of the country between separatist rebels backed by Russia and the Western-backed Ukrainian government. But how did Ukraine get to this point? The best way to understand the current situation is to look at Ukraine's geographic position between Russia and Western Europe. Historically part of the Russian Empire, Ukraine achieved its independence 25 years ago, but is still living at the political and economic fault line between NATO and EU-leaning former Soviet satellite states and republics and Russia. This delicate balance reached a tipping point as Ukraine formally became part of the EU's Eastern Partnership and seemed to be wanting to tie itself closer to Western Europe economically and politically. When the Ukrainian government backtracked on the deal, peaceful protests sprung up in Kiev which exposed deep divisions in Ukrainian society. Clear between those who wanted closer ties with the West and those who wanted to remain closer to Russia. The 2010 presidential election seemed to show Ukraine linguistic, cultural, and ethnic divisions that soon became the focal point for violence, which quickly overshadowed the essential economic problem. The protests sparked a series of military takeovers in Crimea and a subsequent referendum and annexation of that province by Russia. The economic issues centered on Ukraine's position along the main gas pipeline between the resource-rich Russian state and the resource-dependent Western Europe. This again was overshadowed by new separatist movements in the eastern half of the country centered around Donetsk. The separatist movements aimed at further splintering the Ukrainian state. Western media largely blames Russian President Vladimir Putin for being behind these rebel groups in a bid to regain lost Soviet territory and strengthen his nationalist image, going as far as to equate him with Hitler. Whereas the Russians equally blame the West for attempting to pull Ukraine out of its sphere of influence and charge Ukrainian nationalists with being enthralled in modern-day Nazi groups that clearly have ties to a dark past. As over 1 million refugees flee the fighting in the eastern part of the country, a fragile ceasefire attempts to allow all parties to seek a diplomatic solution. There are many in the West who say that the crisis in Ukraine is something that was spawned by Russia. In fact, it is something that is deep within the divisions of Ukraine itself, stemming from its own tortured past. All Russia is trying to do is to protect its own nationals within that country. Ukraine has occupied a key position in between Russia and the West. Indeed, it was part of Imperial Russia and part of the Soviet Union for a long period of time, and only recently has it come over onto what the West considers its side of the bargain. Ukraine, in fact, would like to be independent and not be beholden to the West, but was forced into the Eastern Partnership through lieu of money and the promise of democracy. Then the West embedded a series of individuals into Maidan Square in Kiev in order to foment an overthrow of a democratically elected government, a government which has decided democratically to shift over its programs towards the Russians as opposed to the West. We can see in this map of the 2010 election that indeed Ukraine is divided ethnically and linguistically. And it is true that the eastern side of Ukraine actually would like to be part of Russia. This then is the source of these kind of revolts. And this is also why Crimea, which voted overwhelmingly in the referendum to join Russia, was annexed by us last April. Of course, the West would argue that it's the gas pipelines, and that's what Russia wants to control. But in reality, it is Ukraine's unceasing discrimination of Russian people in the eastern part of its country, again seen in this map, that causes the separatist movement to arise. Russia is merely assisting and helping in the operation to try to protect those Russian nationals from Western influence. Yes, they can brand Putin as Hitler and say that this is the annexation in 1938. But in reality, Russia is there to protect the nationals of Ukraine against an obvious Ukrainian government that has distinct and historical ties to Nazi groups. It is indeed a tragic and unnecessary conflict, but one that was started by Nazi regime in Ukraine and its Western allies to humiliate Russia. It is ridiculous to charge the West with causing the crisis in Ukraine. In fact, it's almost laughable when the actual true source of all the conflict through this whole entire region for the last 200 years has been Russia, and under its other guise is the Soviet Union. A quick look at the map will indicate the fact that Ukraine's tortured history has been at the whims of a much larger power north of it. Even if one were to forget history for a moment about the harvest of sorrow during the 1930s when the Russians starved 5 to 7 million Ukrainians, or the continued repression under the Soviet regime, it would be laughable to consider that Ukraine is a threat to Russia when they're trying to have their own economic independence. The peaceful demonstrations that happened in Maidan Square in Kiev were truly the voice of a democratic people wanting to be free of a Russian overlordship that is trying to dominate them politically, economically, and socially since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. That is the true people who came out during that. Yes, there are divisions within the country, as can be seen in the recent 2010 elections, and yes, there are divisions within the Ukrainian state itself on linguistic, cultural, and ethnic lines. But in no way do these divisions erupt into massive violence without the tacit support, actually the explicit support and encouragement and military cooperation of Russia. This is nowhere more apparent than when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 under the guise of trying to protect its own nationals, when in reality, Russia is trying to exert its old imperial control over the whole entire Eastern European sense. This is why the rebels that are happening in Eastern Europe or Eastern Ukraine are actually a threat to all the Baltic states and Poland, because they know the next thing on the list is Russia's continued expansion throughout Eastern Europe. This is why the military maneuvers by Russia, quote unquote, protecting themselves on the border, are equated with Hitler's actions in 1938. Where Russia will stop, no one is really sure. And it's obviously fabrications about its military operations are clearly manifest. Yes, part of Ukrainian's government has had some historic ties, but this is no idea what the country is about. And this crisis was caused by Russia, manufactured by Russia, and has been continued by Russia. They are to blame.